Everyone knows about the gas chambers of Auschwitz, but few know the darker secret. The executions staged like public performances, designed to kill not just bodies, but hope itself. Why did the Nazis turn murder into a ritual meant to break the living? The name alone sends a shiver down the spine. Auschwitz, a place where over 1 million men, women, and children vanished into smoke, hunger, and silence. For many, the image that lingers is the gas chamber, the chimneys, the endless lines of prisoners waiting for death. Yet hidden within this machinery of mass murder was another, darker theater of cruelty. Public executions staged under the cold eyes of the SS. They did not only kill to eliminate, they killed to perform. In the roll call square, under the watch of thousands forced to stand motionless, wooden gallows rose like skeletal trees. Ropes swayed in the wind. Rifle shots cracked the air, and with each life extinguished, the message echoed louder than words. Hope itself could be strangled. From the very first months of the camp's existence in 1940, these executions were not rare incidents. They became ritual, a calculated spectacle designed to break the spirit of all who still breathed. A man could be hanged for sharing a sip of water, another shot for stealing a crust of bread. No trial, no defense. Only the cold efficiency of terror. Witnesses later recalled how bodies were left dangling for hours, even overnight, until every prisoner had absorbed the lesson. To look away was dangerous. To cry was punishable. Survival meant watching in silence as fellow humans were reduced to warnings carved in flesh. This was the shadow side of Auschwitz rarely spoken of. The killings that did not happen behind sealed doors, but in full view of the living. Death as a weapon, not just against the condemned, but against the will of every prisoner still standing in that square. And so the question lingers. Why, in a camp already perfected for mass extermination, did the Nazis choose to kill in public? The answer leads us into the darkest chambers of fear, control, and human endurance. In the summer of 1940, Auschwitz was not yet the vast industrial complex of death it would later become. At first, it was a converted military barracks near the small Polish town of Oświęcim. Surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and wooden fences, it was built to hold political prisoners from occupied Poland. Teachers, lawyers, priests, officials, men accused of belonging to resistance movements, 728 of them arrived on June 14, 1940, in the very first transport. Their names were erased. They became numbers. Humanity stripped away at the gate itself. The first commandant, Rudolf Höss, ruled with an iron hand. Under him, the SS established rules so harsh that survival became an act of defiance. Prisoners were beaten without cause, starved with rations barely fit for animals, and denied even the most basic medical care. Sickness spread rapidly through overcrowded barracks, where 3 men slept on one plank. Within weeks, Auschwitz became a machine designed not only to imprison bodies, but to crush spirits. And then came the next step, the deliberate use of terror as spectacle. Public execution. At the roll call square, directly in front of the rows of barracks, gallows were built. Prisoners were forced to line up in silence. They were compelled to watch as the condemned were dragged out, beaten, and pushed onto the wooden platforms. Ropes tightened around necks. A boot kicked the stool. The body jerked, the air filled with the sound of choking. No one dared to move. By the end of 1940, at least 40 men had been killed in this way. Some had tried to escape. Others were punished for tiny acts of humanity, offering a sip of water, hiding a scrap of bread, whispering a forbidden word. Evidence was not required. A mere accusation was enough. The SS executed with cold efficiency, determined to make examples out of ordinary men. Their corpses were left dangling for hours, visible to all, a warning carved into the minds of every prisoner who still clung to life. The executions were not limited to the gallows. Rifle fire rang out at the edge of the camp, where shallow pits were dug to receive the fallen. Sometimes men were chosen at random, 10 taken from a block because one had slipped away. The condemned were marched into the yard, ordered to strip of dignity, and lined against the wall. A single bullet to the back of the head ended each life. Behind them, other prisoners were forced to dig the earth, cover the blood, and wait for their own turn. In June 1941, as Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a new wave of prisoners poured into Auschwitz. Soviet captives, many dragged from trains half-naked, starving, too weak to walk. To the SS, these were not soldiers but subhumans. Officers and commissars were singled out, taken behind fences and shot immediately. No record, no name, no trace. For others, there was no trial, no chance. If they stumbled, they were beaten. If they resisted, they were killed. Those who survived the first day faced labor so brutal that death came within weeks. The roll call square grew darker with each passing month. The SS turned executions into ritual, a theater of fear staged before thousands of prisoners. Silence was demanded. Eyes were fixed on the gallows. Even the smallest show of emotion, tears, averted gaze, a whispered prayer, brought the crack of a rifle butt across the face, or worse, another rope prepared on the beam. It was in this crucible of despair that the full character of Auschwitz revealed itself, not merely as a place of death, but as a place where death was displayed, repeated, forced upon the living. Each execution was more than punishment. It was a message. You are powerless, you will watch, you will learn, and you will obey. By the close of 1941, Auschwitz had become more than a camp. It was a carefully engineered laboratory of terror, where killing in plain sight served a greater purpose than any hidden chamber could achieve. It destroyed not just the body of the condemned, but the hope of all who were made to witness. The year 1941 marked a turning point. With the launch of Operation Barbarossa, trains began to pour into Auschwitz almost daily, carrying Soviet prisoners of war in their thousands. Many arrived half-naked, without shoes, driven out of cattle cars in a state of collapse. Some were dragged from the wagons unconscious, their bodies already broken by hunger and exhaustion. For the SS, they were not soldiers. They were not men. They were simply expendable. Those too weak to stand were shot on the spot, often against the camp's back wall or at shallow pits already dug for the purpose. Others were marched to Block 11, the death block, where they were executed without record, their identities erased in silence. The process was mechanical. A prisoner would be ordered forward, bent to the wall, a pistol pressed against the back of the skull. One crack, one fall, another body added to the mound. Prisoners standing in line watched the fate awaiting them, each step forward a march toward inevitability. By mid-1941, public executions had become woven into the daily rhythm of the camp. At roll call, thousands were forced to stand rigid, while gallows were erected before their eyes. The condemned were paraded forward, their numbers read aloud. A rope slipped around the neck, a stool kicked away. Silence fell, except for the sickening gasp of a man fighting for air. Those who dared to look away, those who wept, were beaten savagely or dragged to the front themselves. Bodies were left swinging for hours, sometimes until dawn. Prisoners were compelled to walk past, to confront the sight again and again, until fear sank into their marrow. the brutality reached new levels after an escape in July 1941. When one prisoner slipped from Block 14, panic swept through the SS command. Rudolf Höss decreed collective punishment. 10 men would die for the act of one. They were chosen at random, dragged from the line, locked into the starvation bunker of Block 11. No food, no water, no light. The cell echoed with cries and pounding fists for days, until silence replaced the voices. Among them was Franciszek Gajowniczek, a Polish sergeant who begged for his life, pleading that he had a wife and children. In that moment, another prisoner stepped forward to take his place. Father Maximilian Kolbe, a Catholic priest, offered himself in exchange. In the bunker, he led prayers, gave comfort, and endured week after week without food or water, until finally he was killed with a lethal injection. His sacrifice became a glimmer of humanity inside the abyss. Yet for the SS, the message was cold and clear. Escape meant death, not only for the fugitive but for innocents beside him. Meanwhile, the flow of Soviet prisoners continued. Officers and commissars were singled out, executed immediately, often in groups of dozens. The rest were thrown into forced labor, building fences, digging roads, expanding the camp. Many lasted only days. Exhaustion, starvation, disease, and random beatings cut them down before the month was out. For those who survived, the threat of the gallows loomed at every misstep. By late 1941, the executions took on a ritualistic cruelty. The SS began staging them with deliberate slowness. Gallows were placed in central yards. Prisoners were marched past the swinging corpses, commanded to stare. On some occasions, music was played by the prisoner orchestra, the macabre tones of a march echoing as men choked on ropes above. Death was turned into spectacle, fear sharpened into a blade that pierced every soul. Even the smallest act of defiance invited death. Sharing food, passing a note, pausing at the wrong moment. The SS required no proof. An accusation was enough. Punishment was immediate, public, and absolute. It was designed not merely to end one life, but to erase the will to resist from every witness. By the end of 1942, Auschwitz was no longer just a prison camp. It was a carefully crafted stage of terror, where executions, whether at the wall, on the gallows, or inside the starvation bunker, were used to teach obedience through fear. Every act of violence served two purposes: to kill the body, and to kill the hope of all who still lived. By 1942, Auschwitz had transformed from a camp of punishment into a vast machine of extermination. The gas chambers at Birkenau began operation, swallowing tens of thousands in a matter of weeks. But even as industrial death expanded behind sealed doors, the Nazis did not abandon their older, cruder weapon. Public executions continued, and in many ways grew more cruel, more symbolic, more terrifying. In September 1942, 2 Polish prisoners managed to slip away during a labor detail outside the wire. They stole civilian clothes, crawled through a weakened section of fence, and vanished into the countryside. Their freedom lasted only moments in history, but the punishment was designed to echo forever. 15 men from their work group, none involved in the escape, were dragged before thousands assembled in the roll call square. Hours passed in silence as the SS lectured on betrayal. Then, one by one, each man was placed upon a stool. Each rope tightened, each trapdoor kicked away. The sound of snapping wood mixed with the dull silence of the crowd, forced to watch as hope was strangled from 15 innocent bodies. Only weeks later, in October, another attempt was uncovered. 4 young Jewish prisoners were caught hiding near a drainage ditch, hoping to crawl beyond the camp's gates. The SS seized the moment. every prisoner in the vicinity was forced into the freezing air. Snow fell as the condemned were paraded forward, accused as traitors, and strung from gallows erected just for the occasion. Their corpses swayed against the white backdrop of winter, a warning etched in ice and rope. Through 1942 and into 1943, executions became a constant threat. A scrap of bread passed between hands could mean the noose. A whispered word could mean the wall. Sometimes entire groups were accused without evidence. In one case, 3 men were hanged simply for allegedly sending a message to the women's camp. No message ever found. The lesson was not justice. The lesson was terror. Yet in the midst of this cruelty, seeds of resistance began to grow. Deep inside the Union munitions factory, where prisoners toiled under endless watch, a secret network took shape. Jewish women, Alla Gertner, Regina Safferstein, and Esther Weichblum, risked everything to smuggle gunpowder out of the workshops. Grain by grain, hidden under fingernails, inside hems, beneath buttons, the powder was passed to Sonderkommando units, the prisoners forced to operate the gas chambers and crematoria. For nearly 8 months, this secret continued, a fragile thread of defiance stretched against the iron grip of the SS. At its center stood Rosa Robota, who served as messenger, carrying the smuggled powder to those who prepared for the unthinkable. Each act of smuggling was a death sentence if discovered, yet the women persisted. They understood that survival alone was not enough. The world needed proof that resistance could still burn even in a place designed to extinguish hope. Meanwhile, public executions continued to punctuate every season. Prisoners were dragged into the square for stealing food, for damaging tools, for rumors of sabotage. Gallows rose not just in Auschwitz the furnace, but across Birkenau as well, where new barracks filled with Jews deported from across Europe. On some days, gallows stood in open fields, so that men and women marching to forced labor would pass beneath swaying bodies. Terror traveled with them, imprinted upon every step. The camp had by now become a stage where death wasn't hidden, but displayed. The gas chambers consumed masses in secret, their cries smothered behind walls. But the executions, the hangings, the shootings, the starvation cells were orchestrated as theater. They reminded every living soul that the SS held not just power over life and death, but power over the gaze, the will, the very act of enduring. By the close of 1943, Auschwitz stood as a double-edged horror. On one side, the industrial slaughter of the gas chambers. On the other, the deliberate ritualized killings in public squares and courtyards. Together they formed a single lesson carved into every survivor's memory. In this place, even the act of watching could be turned into an instrument of fear. By 1944, Auschwitz had reached its darkest scale. Trains thundered in day after day, carrying Jews from Hungary, from Greece, from every corner of occupied Europe. The chimneys of Birkenau belched smoke without pause. And yet, within this empire of death, a plan began to form. It was born of desperation, of fury, and of the powder smuggled grain by women who risked everything. On October 7, 1944, the silence of the camp shattered. The Sonderkommando, those condemned to operate the gas chambers and furnaces, chose to rise. For months they had hoarded the stolen gunpowder. For months they had whispered of a final act. That day, they struck. Explosives tore through Crematorium 4, collapsing walls, sending fire and smoke into the cold sky, armed with hammers, stones, and weapons seized from guards. The prisoners fought with ferocity born of hopelessness. SS officers were killed in the chaos, others wounded. For a brief moment, the impossible seemed within reach. the walls of Auschwitz trembling under the weight of rebellion. Some prisoners ran toward the tree line, fleeing into the forest, desperate for freedom that flickered like a mirage. But the triumph was short. Alarms rang, gunfire erupted. SS reinforcements swarmed the grounds with rifles, dogs, and machine guns. The crack of bullets tore through the air. Screams mixed with smoke and fire. The fugitives fell, one after another, cut down before they could taste the forest's shelter. By nightfall, the uprising was crushed. The cost was savage. Over 450 prisoners were captured within 24 hours. Many were marched to Block 11, tortured and executed. Others were lined against the black wall, bullets slamming into their backs, bodies dragged away without ceremony. Still others were taken to the square, where gallows had already been prepared. Before thousands of prisoners forced to watch, the leaders of the rebellion were hanged slowly, one by one. Ropes tightened, feet kicked, silence fell heavy as stone. The SS made the executions deliberate, methodical, unforgettable. Prisoners were forbidden to close their eyes, forbidden to look away. The corpses swayed in the cold wind, a spectacle of vengeance. The message was carved deep into the minds of every onlooker. Defiance would not only fail, it would bring annihilation. Yet even in failure, the uprising left a scar on the camp's iron order. It proved that resistance was possible, even in the heart of darkness. It proved that human dignity could ignite, however briefly, in the face of certain death. The flames of Crematorium Fort had burned not just buildings, but the illusion of complete control. For the SS, the rebellion sparked fury beyond reason. Executions increased, surveillance tightened, suspicion poisoned every barrack. But beneath the terror, the echo of that day remained. A reminder that even in Auschwitz, where hope was strangled daily on the gallows, men still dared to fight. The climax of October 1944 was not victory. It was not escape. It was a cry of defiance drowned in blood. A cry that still lingers, carried by the smoke of that burning crematorium. The new year of 1945 brought no relief to Auschwitz. The Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces advanced from the east. German cities burned under Allied bombs. Yet inside the camp, the machinery of death did not slow. If anything, the cruelty deepened. The SS knew the end was near, and in their desperation they unleashed still more violence upon those who remained. Executions multiplied in those final weeks. Prisoners caught with scraps of food were dragged to the gallows. Men accused of whispering of escape were shot against the wall. At the perimeter fence, ropes were tied hastily to posts, and bodies left dangling as the last flicker of Nazi authority. The SS seemed determined to erase not only life, but the possibility of dignity, right up until the final hour. In mid-January, the order came: evacuate Auschwitz. The Red Army was less than 100 kilometers away. The SS began what survivors would call the death marches. Tens of thousands of emaciated men, women, and children were forced into the snow. Thin striped uniforms offered no protection against the bitter Polish winter. The sick, the weak, the ones who stumbled were shot on the roadside. Their corpses littered the frozen ground, each one a marker of the Empire's retreat. Inside the camp, those deemed too weak to move were left behind. About 7,000 remained, skeletons draped in rags, too frail to walk, too starved to rise from their bunks. They waited among unburied corpses, listening to the echo of gunfire in the distance, uncertain whether liberation or execution would come first. Even as the SS destroyed documents, burned records, and blew up crematoria to erase their crimes, they continued to stage executions. Prisoners discovered hiding in cellars were hanged on the spot. Groups suspected of plotting resistance were marched to Block 11, lined against the wall, and shot as the snow absorbed their blood. The obsession with control, with terror, endured to the very last days. On January 18, 1945, one of the most brutal acts took place. As the columns of prisoners were driven into the frozen countryside, dozens who faltered were killed instantly. At least 30 lay dead within the first day alone. Others who tried to hide within the camp were strung up in clusters along the wire, 3 or 4 at a time, a final warning to anyone who might dream of survival. The camp itself became a landscape of death, silent barracks, empty watchtowers, gallows still standing in the frost. And then, at last, the silence was broken. On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the Red Army entered Auschwitz. What they found was beyond words. Around 7,000 survivors clung to life, many little more than bones wrapped in skin. They lay on wooden planks beside corpses that had not yet been cleared. Their eyes stared blankly at the liberators, too weak even to rise. For them, survival had come not by strength, but by chance. The SS had already fled, abandoning their posts days before. They left behind the ruins of crematoria, the empty gallows, the infamous Black Wall, and the starvation cells of Block 11. They left behind piles of shoes, hair, glasses, proof of the lives already consumed. And they left behind the testimony of those who had seen the executions, who had watched as men swung from ropes, while thousands were forced to witness. In the aftermath, liberation did not erase the scars. For many survivors, the image of the gallows lingered longer than the chimneys. They remembered the silence of thousands forced to stare. They remembered the sound of boots striking stools, the snap of ropes, the thud of bodies. These memories became evidence that the Nazis had not only killed, but had made killing a ritual. The end of Auschwitz was not sudden triumph. It was a hollow victory, filled with silence, corpses, and shadows. But within those shadows, the truth remained. Even at the edge of defeat, the SS had tried to kill hope itself. And yet, in the ashes of January 1945, hope returned. Fragile, broken, but alive. When the guns finally fell silent, Auschwitz did not disappear. Its chimneys, its barracks, its gallows still stood against the Polish sky. What remained was not only a landscape of ruins, but a crime scene that demanded judgment. The world could no longer look away. In 1946, Rudolf Höss, the first commandant, was captured after months in hiding. He confessed not only to the operation of the gas chambers, but also to authorizing countless public executions in the roll call square. He was extradited to Poland, tried in Warsaw, and condemned to die. In April 1947, a gallows was erected at Auschwitz itself. Just steps from where he had signed death orders, Höss was hanged before witnesses. Justice, though measured in one man's fall, echoed with the weight of millions. Others followed. Arthur Liebe Henschel, who succeeded Höss as commandant, was captured, tried in Krakow, and executed in 1948. Maria Mandel, who had overseen the women's camp at Birkenau, personally ordering the hanging of female prisoners, was captured by the Americans, extradited, and likewise hanged in 1948. Hundreds of SS men faced tribunals across Europe. Some were sentenced to death, others to long years in prison. Yet many slipped into obscurity, lost in the chaos of a shattered continent. Still, the trials marked a reckoning. The gallows built for victims now claimed the executioners. But justice was not only legal, it was memory. Survivors carried the images etched into their minds, men dangling from ropes in silence, the black wall stained with blood, the starvation cells echoing with cries. They testified before courts, before historians, before the world. Their voices turned personal pain into collective memory, ensuring that the terror of public execution at Auschwitz could never be dismissed as rumor or forgotten as shadow. Today, Auschwitz stands preserved as a museum, a memorial, a warning carved into brick and barbed wire. Visitors walk past Block 11, where countless were condemned. They see the gallows, reconstructed where prisoners once fell. They stand before the infamous wall, its surface still scarred. Each site tells a story, not only of death, but of how death was used as theater, how execution became spectacle, how terror was designed to destroy the will to resist. The legacy is not only about cruelty, it is also about defiance. Father Maximilian Kolbe, who gave his life in place of another, is remembered as a saint. Rosa Robota and the women who smuggled gunpowder into the Sonderkommando uprising are honored as heroines. Their names shine as fragments of light against overwhelming darkness. They proved that even in Auschwitz, even in a place built to annihilate hope, humanity endured. The executions at Auschwitz reveal a truth more chilling than numbers alone. Genocide was not hidden. It was not only smoke behind sealed doors. It was rope before thousands of eyes. It was bullets fired as warning. It was corpses left hanging to remind the living of their own fragility. Death was weaponized, not only to destroy, but to be seen destroying. That is the shadow that lingers. The knowledge that the Nazis did not merely kill, they made others watch. They turned survival into complicity, forced memory into obedience. And yet, memory did not vanish. It survived in testimony, in museums, in the vow carried across generations. Never again. The gallows at Auschwitz are silent now. The black wall no longer echoes with shots. But their presence endures, standing as both memorial and warning. They remind us that cruelty thrives in silence, that terror feeds on indifference. And they demand that every visitor, every listener, every generation remember. The legacy of Auschwitz is not only in the ashes of the crematoria. It is in the ropes that swayed before crowds. It is in the faces forced to watch. It is in the silence that followed each death. And it is in the vow spoken after liberation that such shadows must never be allowed to fall across humanity again.